So it's 10 a.m. in Central Europe, and I think 1 p.m. in Baku, and we're ready to start this seminar. Uh, my name is Niels Krabbe. I'm a senior researcher with the World Maritime University. I've previously worked with negotiations relating to oceans and have been writing about different issues connected to law and climate and the oceans. And I'm very proud to host this Virtual Ocean Pavilion side event, which is titled The Ocean Carbon Cycle, Bridging Science Policy Development and Concrete Action. And the background to this seminar is that the ocean carbon cycle plays a crucial role in regulating the global climate, taking up approximately 25% of the CO2 emitted into the atmosphere and separately storing massive quantities of carbon in the ocean interior, much of it by a series of processes known as the biological carbon pump. The ocean carbon cycle thereby increases the ocean's ability to reduce the atmospheric carbon. And while recent evidence indicate that terrestrial carbon sinks appear to absorb less carbon than previously assumed, the potential of the oceans remain largely unexplored and untapped, as it so far has not been considered fully in management. As international law and policy is evolving, this may, however, be about to change. And in this seminar, which is hosted by the World Maritime University and the EU Horizon Project Ocean ICU, we will discuss the ocean carbon cycle from different perspectives, integrating presentations on recent scientific findings with perspectives on how ocean carbon should be considered in policy and how it connects to the UNFCCC, as well as the new Global Oceans Agreement, the BBNJ, and concrete action. We aim to promote a more focused discussion on ocean carbon in climate negotiations. And I have with me a very distinguished panel of speakers, and I will introduce them as we go along. But allow me also here to encourage everyone throughout this discussion to use the questions functions at the bottom of your Zoom pages to write questions. There will be a discussion at the end of the seminar. But first of all, in this long line of speakers, I'm very glad to introduce my colleague Richard Sanders, who is the director of ICO's Ocean Thematic Center in Bergen, which is a key component of the ICO's research infrastructure. And prior to his move to Bergen in 2019, he was the chair of the Ocean Biogeochemistry and Ecosystem Research Group in NOC Southampton. He is the coordinator of the Horizon Project Ocean ICU, focused on understanding industrial impacts on the ocean carbon cycle, and TRICASCO, which is a research infrastructure aiming to integrate efforts from multiple platforms together to better measure ocean carbon uptake in the Southern Ocean. So please, Dr. Richard Sanders, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Niels. And hello to everybody who's watching, and hello to all my fellow panelists, and thank you very much for joining this panel and for giving us the opportunity to speak. I'm looking forward to the discussion and think it's going to be exciting. So I've rather grandly titled my presentation, Ocean Carbon Cycle Science, What We Know, What We Don't Know, and What We Need to Know. And I'm going to try and tell you something about what we know. I'm going to touch on what we don't know. And I think the panelists are going to expand a lot on the future actions that we need to undertake so that we get the information we need. So next slide, please. So as Neil said, this is focused on the ocean carbon cycle. And this opening slide is from the Global Carbon Project. So the Global Carbon Project is a huge endeavour supported by many, many groups worldwide that reports annually to the COP the state of the global carbon cycle. And this is a famous slide that shows where the carbon that we emit to the atmosphere, termed sources on the left-hand side, ends up in the planetary system on the right-hand side. So you can see that around half of the carbon that we emit remains in the atmosphere. Slightly more than a quarter ends up in the terrestrial biosphere, and slightly less than a quarter, or around a quarter, ends up in the ocean. And that oceanic uptake is mainly a physical process driven simply by putting more atmospheric CO2 into, or more CO2 into the atmosphere. So there's a concentration gradient leading to a flux into the ocean. Next slide, please. So we know this based on a whole set of different activities that scientists and technicians and researchers around the world undertake. We refer to this as the ocean carbon value chain, and this is shown in diagrammatic or diagrammatic way in this slide. So at the bottom of this triangle, we have observations at sea that people make. Then we have data synthesis activities. Then we have mapping activities. And then we have policy activities. So you can see that in this way, observations that people make of the ocean feed directly through on an annual basis to informing the COP, so that decisions about what to do next can be made informed by science. Next slide, please. So this is a figure that comes from the Global Carbon Project Annual Synthesis of Information. And you can see that what it shows is along the bottom axis is time, so that's dating back around 40 years. And up the right-hand side is the carbon dioxide uptake flux by the ocean. And you can see that in general terms, it's increased over time. As we put more CO2 into the atmosphere, the flux into the ocean increases. But I'd like you to look at the right-hand side, where you can see a green line, which is the mean of the data product. So that's the data that's used to calculate ocean uptake. And underneath that is a blue line, which is the mean of the numerical models that are also used to calculate ocean carbon uptake. And the black line in the middle is the average, and that's the one that we refer to normally. But the two outliers, the green and the blue, differ substantially from each other by a rather significant amount, around 0.8 petagrams of carbon per year. So we have a situation where our models and our data don't agree with each other, and there's substantial uncertainty around the size of that ocean carbon sink. Next slide, please. So this is really important because we have independent evidence. This is from The Guardian fairly recently. We have independent evidence that the terrestrial sink may be changing. And if that's the case, then we have a really big focus on what the ocean is doing. Will the ocean sink increase to compensate? Will the ocean sink stay static? How will the planet respond to these significant changes? And if we have uncertainty in our ability to measure carbon uptake, then it means that addressing these key issues is rather more complex. Next slide, please. So in response to these sorts of issues, the WMO, that's the World Meteorological Organization, suggested that it would be a sensible thing to do to bring into play a whole planet system for measuring the ocean, measuring greenhouse gases. So measuring not only emissions but also fluxes into the terrestrial and oceanic biosphere. And the ocean participated very, very strongly in this. You can see a quote there that suggests that this broad engagement by different sectors of the global science community really drove this important activity forward. Next slide, please. And so the ocean has been building on this by thinking through how we're going to respond to that WMO mandate to what we call operationalize this value chain. So at the moment, it's a series of ad hoc activities, but we need to put them on a much more professional and well-funded footing. And there's a whole lot of activity going on in the background around that, about who's going to do which parts and how's it all going to be sustained. Next slide, please. So in summary, the ocean community is ready to deliver the Global Greenhouse Gas Watch. We have thought through what sort of activities we need to do. We're beginning to put in place the international structures to drive that, and we're beginning to engage really very strongly in the whole G3W machine to make sure that we can produce the information that's needed for the next phase of climate negotiations. Next slide, please. So I've spoken mainly about the surface uptake, which is the red arrows in this diagram. This is an authoritative summary of the global carbon cycle with the ocean center stage. So we've spoken about the red arrows, but in addition to the red arrows, which is the anthropogenic perturbation, there's also a whole series of black arrows on this slide, which is the natural carbon cycle. And the natural carbon cycle is characterized by numbers that are substantially larger than the perturbation. So against this uh, inter in addition to the sort of modifications that humans are making to it, when considering how the ocean will respond, we also need to consider how the natural carbon cycle will respond. Next slide, please. And the further factor that we need to think through is how the ocean natural carbon cycle, which is, as I said, very large, will respond to the increasing demands that we're placing on the ocean to sustain our way of life over the next few years. The ocean is likely to play a significant role in our transition to net zero. We're likely to extract materials from it for energy transition by deep sea mining. We're likely to put major energy halving infrastructures into the ocean, and protein from the ocean supports millions worldwide. And so one key research question that we're focusing on is how will these processes actually affect the ocean carbons? Next slide, please. So I don't have much time to go into a lot of detail, and I'm sure that others will pick these up, but there are recent indications that fish, the role that fish play is in the natural carbon cycle is rather substantial. This paper suggests that they contribute 16 or 17% to the amount of carbon that sinks out of the ocean. Next slide, please. And other papers have suggested that prior to human exploitation, the role of fish was rather different from what it is now. So the clear suggestion is that some of these industrial activities that we undertake now, that we've been undertaking for many years, have actually been happening at such scale that the natural carbon cycle has been modified significantly. Next slide, please. So that's it from me. In conclusion, I'd just like to say that the ocean is a key part of the global carbon cycle. The ocean carbon community is stepping up and is really ready to bring that information through to policymakers, and that a key focus that I think we're going to be discussing now is how the natural carbon cycle will respond to the pressures that we're placing on the ocean. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. That was very focused and also very interesting, and I think also a bit hopeful, which is good. It raises many questions. I will not ask them now, but rather leave the floor to our next speaker, which I think will continue with a bit of scientific background before we move more into the direction of policy negotiations and real action. So our next speaker is Dr. Natalia Gallo, who is a marine ecologist and biological oceanographer working at the Norwegian Research Centre as part of the Horizon EU Ocean ICU and Marco Polo projects. Her overarching interests are in how climate change impacts deep sea ecosystems and how scientific research can support sustainable ocean management and development. She's passionate about the science policy interface, which is good because that's what this seminar is about, right? And has participated in 8 climate and ocean-focused United Nations conferences. She is involved in the Early Career Ocean Professionals Group of the UN Decade of Ocean Science, the IOC UNESCO Global Ocean Oxygen Network, and Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative. She's also on the Advisory Council for the Norway Pacific Ocean Climate Scholarship Program, which is an interdisciplinary PhD program. So we're so glad to have you with us, Natalia, please.
Thank you so much, Niels. I'm also really glad to be here with you all, either morning, afternoon, when you're joining. And yeah, today my talk is focused on marine carbon dioxide removal, with a focus on the impacts and knowledge gaps. So next slide, please. As Richard presented in his talk, we know that the ocean already plays an essential role in uptaking excess anthropogenic carbon dioxide. And we know that this is through different mechanisms, and specifically Ocean ICU is looking at the biological carbon pump mechanisms that play this really important role in allowing the ocean to take up additional anthropogenic CO2. But we know that there are also non-biological processes at play, and so lots of these natural processes which are already allowing the ocean to play this really important role in kind of buffering us from the true kind of cost of our CO2 emissions. And so here on the figure on the right, you see that depending on which SSPs we take in the future, you see that the ocean will already be taking up between 250 and 550 gigatons extra of carbon. So if we move to the next slide, So that's already just through the natural processes that are at play. But recently, there has been growing interest in how the ocean can be employed even further as a player for carbon removal through negative emission technologies. And this basically is because we are not making fast enough progress in order to reduce our CO2 emissions. And now we really need to look at negative emission technologies to help kind of eat up some of that part of the pie. And so the ones that are focused on the ocean are either termed ocean-based climate interventions or marine carbon dioxide removal, CDR. That's what I'll be referring to it in my talk today. And certainly last year at the UNFCCC COP, and I'm sure this year at the UNFCCC COP, there will be many events that will be focused on MCDR, potentially as a silver bullet to our kind of climate crisis. But it's really important to remember that most of the removed carbon ends up being stored in the deep ocean in these proposals. But as you can see in the figure on the left, where we can look at some of these different ocean-based carbon dioxide removal technologies, in a lot of these graphics, really, you see the carbon going into the deep ocean, but you really don't see any sort of kind of fleshing out of which specific deep ocean ecosystems or processes that this carbon is interacting with or affecting. And so myself and a group of colleagues through the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative have really taken a look at this and have tried to shed light on this deep sea component of these proposed MCDR methods. And so we've produced this policy brief, Considerations for Deep Sea Environmental Impact Research on Marine Carbon Dioxide Removal, which is available at this QR code, or also if you just search DOSI policy briefs and information sheets, you'll find both this policy brief as well as an excellent variety of other ones. Next slide. And so first of all, for us as deep ocean scientists, it's really important that we communicate that the deep sea is not a disconnected, homogeneous black box as is usually presented in these proposals. Instead, there's a lot of heterogeneity in the deep sea. You have really diverse ecosystems, some of which are just shown here as examples on the right. You have this incredible mesopelagic zone. You have these really diverse different seafloor habitats like deep sea coral reefs, hydrothermal vents, deep sea trenches. So, I mean, these are really different types of environments that this extra carbon could be interacting with. At the same time, there are a lot of really important processes that are taking place that link both the shallow and the coastal ocean to the deep ocean. And so kind of you can't just put things in the deep ocean and hope that there's no interaction. You really need to be able to understand the interactions and the feedbacks that can occur. Next slide, please. And so in this policy brief, one of the things that we're trying to do is take a look at what some of those potential deep sea impacts are, and then also how different types of experiments can allow us to better assess the impacts of different MCDR approaches for the deep sea specifically. And so we specifically look at direct ocean capture, ocean alkalinity enhancement, organic matter sinking, ocean fertilization, and carbon capture and storage as part of this work. Next slide. And so here I'm just showing some of the kind of key findings. And so what we see is there are two different methods that really are adding organic carbon as the main way of sequestering carbon. And so those are proposals for ocean fertilization and proposals for organic matter dumping. And so it's really key when we think about addition of organic carbon is that we're thinking about how that changes food supplies in the deep ocean. And so here it's also really key to think about the amount, the timing, the location, the particle size, the underlying oxygen conditions, and the source and processing of organic material for being able to flash out those specific deep sea impacts because those affect how that organic matter will be degraded. And then when organic matter is degraded, oxygen is taken up, CO2 is produced, and you can also get production of hydrogen sulfide and methane. So you can have these additional environmental impacts of this additional organic matter storage. Next slide. Here are two other methods. So here we're looking at direct ocean capture and then electrochemical ocean alkalinity enhancement. And both of these kind of may have similar impacts on deep sea ecosystems because both of them have a need for really high volumes of seawater to be taken in. And so here, one of the main concerns is actually thinking about the entrainment of deep sea plankton because this would be an ongoing process. And so we know that there are deep sea organisms that migrate to shallow waters at night. These could be entrained and killed during this process. And then also a lot of deep organisms actually have shallow larval stages. And so kind of thinking about this planktonic larval mortality is quite key for both of these methods. Next slide. And then lastly here, I just wanted to show that other MCDR methods like mineral-based ocean alkalinity enhancement or carbon capture and storage in the deep sea, these potentially have impacts in terms of disturbance. So mineral-based ocean alkalinity enhancement adds a lot of minerals to the water, although you don't really want them to be sinking out, but some part of it does sink out. And so here, mineral type, particle size, sinking speed, amount, duration, and timing are really important variables to consider because you can see interactions with these small sinking particles and they can clog respiratory or filtration structures of these deep sea organisms. And then we also see some potential seafloor impacts of, for example, installation of CO2 injection infrastructure for carbon capture and storage. But these types of examples are things that you can find in the policy brief. So I'm just giving you just a short demonstration here. Next slide. The other thing that we find in our work is that it's very important for MCDR consideration to include social governance and equity concerns. And the reason for this is that, again, this is kind of being viewed right now as a silver bullet. There's a lot of excitement around this, and it's important that as we proceed, we make sure that everyone who's needed to be at the table is at the table. It's important to understand how different communities perceive and may be impacted by MCDR technologies. Also, as Richard pointed out in his presentation, being able to do these types of ocean observations is very expensive. And so far, MCDR research has been led mainly by industrialized nations. And of course, this is an equity concern as this becomes more and more commercially interesting. And we need to make sure we focus on equitable governance frameworks that guide profit distribution and then a good cost-benefit analysis of both the local environmental impacts versus the climate benefits of different MCDR proposals. And of course, MCDR wouldn't be the only industry in the ocean, right? It's going to interact with other ocean-based industries and have cumulative impacts. So that also needs to be part of our consideration. Next slide, please. The other thing that I wanted to point out is that MCDR is actually a really important knowledge gap that has been identified in the IPCC AR6 report. It reports. And also the ocean carbon cycle is a really important knowledge gap that has been presented across the IPCC AR6 reports. And we can see this based on this analysis and paper that my colleagues and I worked on, and that was just recently published. And there's another policy brief available. So if you scan the QR code on the right, you can have access to that. But basically what we were able to do was we did a meta-analysis of all of the IPCC AR6 reports and identified all of the knowledge gaps that pertain to the deep ocean that were there and identified what those were and kind of grouped them into key areas. But another thing we found that was really important and has been previously reported from other IPCC reports is that the way the IPCC process works is that it tends to focus on things that are high certainty. And this is quite important because in the deep ocean, we have very low certainty because of how difficult it is to collect these observations. And as a result, when you try and present information and have it included in IPCC reports for these systems that have more uncertainty, you actually end up omitting these kind of low certainty findings in the IPCC process. And this becomes more and more true kind of the higher level that IPCC document is. So the proportion of high certainty statements goes up as you get into the executive summaries and summary for policymakers, and the proportion of low certainty statements goes down, right? So this is quite important to keep in mind. Next slide, please. So just some take-home messages. Many uncertainties still remain about the efficacy, scale, and degree of impacts, which vary by marine carbon dioxide removal method. And before we kind of go forward with these technologies, we have to make sure we understand the risks, the costs, and the benefits, including for deep sea habitats and processes. And kind of specific areas we really need more understanding on is how the timescales of carbon sequestration vary among the methods and the deep sea areas where they're implemented over. We need to have reliable monitoring, reporting, and verification of these processes. We need to have robust environmental impact assessments. We need to make sure that we include social governance and equity concerns in the development of the kind of trajectories of MCDR. And we should remember that poor observational capacity leads to low certainty, which then leads to the omission of critical climate processes in IPCC reports, just because of how the IPCC process is set up to really focus on high certainty statements. And again, I just provide a QR link to both of those policy briefs. And my last slide is just to say thank you for your attention. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Natalia, for that. And we should definitely keep an eye out for those policy briefs. I actually managed to download them myself while watching this, and I recommend everyone to look into them. Thank you very much. Very interesting. So now we have sort of both sort of a scientific background and also sort of transcending a bit into policy recommendations. And I think now we're going for a deep dive or a case study of how ocean carbon can work in one context, and that would be a rather cold context, I think. So next presenter is Dr. Emma Cavan, who is a senior lecturer in ocean biochemistry and ecology at Imperial College London. She has spent over 10 years researching how carbon is sequestered through the biological pump and how human pressures work to impact this carbon sink. She is part of many UK and internationally funded projects on all aspects of the biological pump, but has a particular interest in the Southern Ocean, Antarctic krill and fishing, which I think we will be discussing now. Emma is also co-chairs of the ICES working group Fish Carbon, bringing together international experts to address the impact of fishing on the biological pump. So please, Emma, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Niels, and hi everyone. It's really great to be here with you today. So yeah, we're going to do a deep dive into some tiny polar animals, the Antarctic krill. And even though they're tiny, they have quite a big story to tell in terms of the biological carbon pump, but also how we can present like a case study of how we can protect the biological carbon pump from human impacts. Next slide, please. So the biological carbon pump can be defined as a type of blue carbon. Blue carbon is really associated with coastal and marine ecosystems that store carbon. And these are things you may have heard of, like tidal marshes, mangroves, and seagrasses. And you may be aware vaguely from some public information that they are important in storing carbon. And it's actually, they store most of the carbon in the soils. It's not actually the plants themselves, but the roots kind of help stabilize sediment and allow lots of carbon to be trapped. And we have this missing component of what the open ocean does. And it means that the open ocean carbon cycle doesn't get the same press and media coverage as these other coastal carbon stores, and there isn't as much conservation. It's you can go out if you live near the sea maybe and plant some seagrass seeds, but you can't really go and grow some plankton easily. So there are also different considerations from that aspect. Next. And so we have this missing oceanic plankton component. So you can see lots of arrows, but what I really want you to take from this open ocean picture is that the biological carbon pump is formed of hundreds, if not thousands, of different species interacting. So it's a lot of complex biology, and because it's out in the open ocean, it also makes it more challenging to observe. And so what I'm really interested in finding out is how much carbon a component of this biological pump is storing or sequestering, and what is its monetary value? Because when you can put a dollar sign on something, it kind of means you can compare it to other systems. Next slide, please. So just to highlight how important this pump is, although we have heard already, but without this biological pump, there'd be 50% more CO2 in the atmosphere than there is currently. So it is really important that we do understand more. Next. And this carbon pump or this plankton carbon sink is really everywhere in the global oceans. So from this map, everywhere is purple. There's still the pump is in action, but where it's yellow and green is even there's really high, strong carbon sequestration by open ocean organisms, particularly plankton, so phytoplankton and zooplankton. Next. And of course, if we have this important plankton carbon sink everywhere in the ocean, that means it interacts with humans doing some stuff to the ocean and extracting things like fish. So in all of these orange pixels, we have really high fishing grounds, but also we have high plankton carbon sinks. So it's where the two things overlap. And as you can see in the top image, fish are important in its biological pump, either directly through sinking carbon to the deep ocean themselves, or by having kind of a regulatory role in controlling the food chain and stabilizing ecosystems. So essentially, fishing is likely to be having an impact on this carbon sink. Next. And as well as fishing, there are, of course, other threats, which we've also heard. So climate change, warming, acidifying seas, sea ice loss is also really important. We have different aspects of pollution, chemical pollution, plastic pollution, and also deep sea mining. And I'm going to touch on some of these issues as I focus now on Antarctic krill. So Antarctic krill are fairly small, but they're actually not that small. So they're about the size of your little finger. So for something that we think of as microscopic, it's not that microscopic. They're really important in the Southern Ocean. Loads of stuff eats them. So all of the beautiful blue whales and other whales that live in Antarctica, seals, penguins, albatrosses, and they're known as a keystone species, which means they're fundamental to the ecosystem. If you removed Antarctic krill, kind of the Southern Ocean ecosystem as we know it would collapse all look very different to how it does now. Next. Oh, you can go again. That was a video, but we don't need it. They are hugely abundant. This map, same color scheme as you saw before, where it's purple, there are less krill, but there's still Antarctic krill. Where it's yellow or green, there are loads. They're found everywhere in the Southern Ocean, but particularly in the South Atlantic part of the Southern Ocean. Next. But they are also fished. And that's kind of a big issue for Antarctic krill on the carbon sink. So they're fished for pet food. What else are they used for? Aquaculture feed. So to feed other farmed fish. They're also used for their really high omega-3 levels. So you can go to a pharmacy and buy fish oil krill oil as you would fish oil. Next. And the way that they're important in the carbon sink is through their feces. So poo really. They produce these really kind of torpedo-like almost, very kind of aerodynamic or water fluid dynamic fecal pellets that can get quickly to the deep ocean, and they can reach hundreds and hundreds of meters. And because they can get so deep so quickly, these pellets that are really rich in carbon can be stored in the deep ocean for over 100 years. And in blue carbon science or carbon sequestration science, this kind of 100-year mark is the really key metric for how long we want carbon to be stored for. Ideally longer, but at least 100 years to make it kind of relevant to climate policy. Next. So I worked with some amazing co-authors to basically try and go from right here is how much krill there is in the ocean to how much carbon are they sinking through their fecal pellets. And what surprised us, if we focus on the bottom line, so next bit please, is you can see that just through feces alone, the amount of million tons of carbon that's stored per year from krill poo is the same magnitude as mangroves, seagrasses, and tidal marshes. And when you add up their other components, so molts when they shed their exoskeletons or their migrations, it's even more. And remember, I said the biological pump is formed of hundreds, if not thousands, of different species of organisms, and this is just one species alone. So think how big this number could be if we could expand further. And to put a monetary value on it, it's about 40 to 40 billion US dollars per year. So next slide, please. So this is my final one. So what? Krill can store carbon, but they're really far away from us. What can we do with this knowledge? Well, because they're fished, we can then start to get some of this data and science into the fishing policy to try and protect that essential blue carbon stores. We also can use it as another incentive to try and help reduce emissions and help each COP to write the ocean, protecting the ocean narrative, because They need the ice to for the krill nurseries, and so melting sea ice is really bad for this biological carbon pump. And also just to try and increase public awareness. So there are things we can do on land and change our lifestyle that will actually help protect this carbon pump by feeding our pets something different or not buying krill oil. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Emma, and very much a deep dive, I think, but also ending with a few concrete suggestions on how consumer patterns and our behavior could change to promote these ocean carbon effects. Thank you very much. So going from that to perhaps segueing a bit further into the side of policy. Our next speaker is Dr. Rachel Tiller, who is the Chief Scientist at SINTEF Ocean, with special responsibility for research on sustainable multi-level ocean governance and global environmental politics. She is also the director of the strategic research area of biodiversity and area use in SINTEF. Her expertise is in inter and transdisciplinary global environmental politics, from the high seas to land-sea interactions in coastal regions at all levels of governance analysis, from local stakeholder participatory perceptions to global ocean governance frameworks and agreement. So please, Dr. Rachel Tiller, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Nils, and thank you for having me. So we've just gone through some really interesting talks, going from like the very interesting discussion about what the biological pump even is, how important it is, talking a little bit about some of the methods for storing carbon and what the implications of those are. And then going down into the krill part. Now, I love the deep ocean, but I am a political scientist. And I was first introduced to krill when I started my PhD in 2005. And in 2006, for those of you who don't know much about krill and don't care much about krill, because who cares about what happens at the bottom of the ocean, right? If you've ever seen the movie Happy Feet, you will have seen the krills as a bi-role in that movie. If you haven't seen Happy Feet, shame on you, go see Happy Feet. It's a really cute movie, but it also gives you a little bit of an introduction to what the krill are and how important they are, and how important the ecosystem is in general in the ocean. But what I was studying with when I first got introduced to the krill was actually the tiny, tiny little sister of the krill, which is the red feed. So it's a very small version of the krill, where the krill kind of looks like a shrimp. So does the red feed, just a very, very small version of it. And I looked into, and this, mind you, this was in 2005. It was about how climate change in the ocean could affect international relations in the Arctic. And that was in terms of how climate change could affect sea surface temperatures, but also currents and ocean acidification, and how would that affect the big major fisheries? Because Natalie said something important in saying that you need to include social governance and equity concerns. And those are really, really important, because there's people living near the ocean. And these people and us tend to enjoy food. So we do need to have an industry that actually goes out and harvests from the ocean. The ocean is about 70% of the earth, and we harvest about 2% of our proteins from the ocean. So even though there's a really great argument for cutting down on using the ocean, there's an even bigger argument for actually finding ways of sustainably harvesting the ocean. So I was just at COP16 on biodiversity in Cali in Colombia. And Peter Thompson, who's the UN Special Envoy of the Ocean, he gave a really good example of this, talking about how there's this big arm wrestle between conservation and sustainable use, and how this is not an arm wrestle that any one of these two want to win, because we do need to have that balance, because without that balance, either way, someone's going to lose, because we will still be around. So it's really like interesting to see how we do need this inclusion, but we do need conservation. And that is why we also have worked on this, if you could do the next slide, from many years. So the ocean itself, for example, they've discussed ocean governance, and we've known how important the ocean governance is since the 50s. So in 1956, they first started discussing, should we maybe govern the ocean? Should we try to figure out a way to share responsibility of the ocean, find a way to be more sustainable in our harvest of it? But mind you, it took 40 years for us to get that agreement. So people in high buildings like this one in New York do spend a lot of time talking about this. And in the meantime, we do need some more concrete actions going on. And already in 1972, though, you know, just a few years after that, they decided to meet in Stockholm, and they were like, okay, we really do need to start worrying about the governance of the environment, because we seem to be in trouble. And that was not just in terms of the ocean, it was actually more in terms of land, but also climate change. Next. So what we happened in the end, 20 years after that again, because again, mind you, things go slow when you're at the political level. That's when you got the Rio Trio, which is why you guys are here today, which is why I was in Cali, which was why a lot of other people are going to go to a different COP soon. So the Rio Trio, which you'll hear a lot about, and which you should just remind yourself every time you hear it, that it's not a drink, it's actually, you know, it's a real thing. It's 3 conventions and 3 COPs. So these conventions, of course, are climate change, where you are right now, but it's also biodiversity, where I was just at, which was at the 16th meeting. And it's one on desertification. I'm not going to get into that one right now because I like to stay in the ocean. But the connection between the ocean and climate change and what they can do in terms of biodiversity and how these are all interlinked, that is a really important part of this. And if you can go to the next one, Global Biodiversity Framework was adopted 2 years ago. And in that one, there was a lot more focus on sustainable use of the ocean, but also on climate change and how these interact with biodiversity. Now, as an ocean enthusiast, which I know many of you must be since you're here, this image is from the opening ceremony in Cali. And the focus on the ocean at this Global Biodiversity Framework was amazing. And it was so much talk about it and what the ocean can do. So we heard Natalie talk about some of the things that the ocean can do and what the worries we need to think about. But we also did talk a lot about how the ocean is affected, not just within national jurisdiction, which is where this global biodiversity framework centers. Because if you think of the world, it's like all the countries along coast, they have fences around them, and they make those decisions within their own yards. But the majority of the ocean is outside those yards. Next. And in that area, we also recently got a new treaty, a treaty where countries again came together and said, you know what, we're going to have to do something about that area as well, because it's not enough just to mow the lawns in our own yards. We do need to make sure that we're picking up the trash outside our yards. We need to make sure we're not polluting. And we need to make sure we understand that those systems are very connected with our system. So even though they're far away, they're connected to what we do. So in terms of the Global Biodiversity Framework and in terms of IPCC and IPBES, so I'm just throwing out the alphabet soup here, but these big level global panels that have scientists say what we need to do to save the Earth, at least 30% of the ocean needs to be conserved. And it needs to be conserved so that we can have a future as well. Of course, this still means 70% can still be sustainably used. So this is important when everyone goes into panic mode about 30% protection, to remember 70% is still open for business, but sustainable as such, because recall, this arm wrestle thing needs to get into balance. But we have this new treaty, and that is for the outer side of the fence so that we can harvest that as well, but also sustainably manage it so we can get to 30%. Next. One of the challenges, of course, is that much of the sustainable use of the ocean is all about fisheries, and all about fisheries is not included outside those fences. So that is something that I hope Niels will get into. So if we go to the next slide, I just want to give you an overview of what the world of ocean governance looks like at the top. So you can see there, UNCLOS to the far left there. That's that big treaty I talked about that took 40 years for them to discuss and agree on. Under that, you have the BB&J, which is, you know, outside of the national fences, and you have those regional fisheries management organizations coming out of this fish stock agreement. So we have covered fish, even covered deep sea mining. We've covered a lot of stuff under UNCLOS, but all those other things, if you see the CBD, that's in conventional biological diversity, you see UNFCCC, that's why you're here today. Those are not part of the ocean, but they're so closely interrelated to it. Next. And the thing is, if we don't understand this top level, we won't even know how to get down to the bottom, to where people are actually implementing all these things. So this is Norway. I'm from Norway. I live in Norway. This is part of my public information to the world. That's the second largest island in Norway. That's where I am from. Ever go to Norway, make sure you hit that. It's an island that has everything in Norway. It has fisheries, it has aquaculture, it has lots of agriculture, it has tourism en masse, and it's highly affected by climate change and what happens in the ocean. Obviously, climate affects the ocean there, and it affects the people that live there. And we want to electrify our fishing vessels. And we want to make sure that there's enough energy on this island. And this is an island where last time I was there, there was one place to charge your car, and that was on my dad's campground. So if we're going to electrify all this, we're also going to need a lot of new energy sources. We're going to need a lot of clean energy sources. And Norway is big on wanting to have more sources farther out to sea. All of those might also depend on getting more minerals. And all of these energy saving sources for climate will also affect biodiversity. So these are some of the challenges. And in Norway alone, this is a big challenge. Now you can even imagine how this is going to be in countries that have lower capacity than they do in Norway. And that is what I'm going to now send you over to Fuad, so he can tell you a little bit about it. And do keep in contact if you want to hear more about what we do at SINTEF.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for providing us with that background of international environmental law and policy and how all of this connects to climate. And thank you also for sort of situating the BBNJ agreement, the new Global Oceans Agreement, in relation to all of these policy measures and international environmental agreements. Because the BBNJ agreement is, I think, something which will be discussed in our next presentation, which will be held by Fuad Batu, who consults for a variety of organizations and institutions working in development law and negotiations related to environment and natural resources. On behalf of the State of Palestine, as 2019 chair of the Group of 77 in China, he coordinated the positions of G77 and led negotiations at the International Intergovernmental Conference to develop the BBNJ agreement. And support to the State of Palestine continued throughout the BBNJ negotiations process, where Fuad was a strong voice and advocate for including climate aspects as part of the G77 in China team coordination and negotiation group. Fuad, we're so glad to have you here and to explain perhaps a little bit about how the BBNJ agreement connects to ocean carbon. So please, Fuad, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Niels, and thank you to the organizers and hosts. And it was really a pleasure to learn more from Richard, Natalia, Emma, and Rachel. I have titled this Promoting Blue Carbon Capacity under the BBNJ Agreement. If you go to the next slide, we start to talk about the biological pump, but I think that's been well covered. So if you'll pass to the next slide. Again, climate and ocean. Now, here we get into the biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction treaty that was open for signature just in the last year. Some people refer to it as the High Seas Treaty. I won't ever refer to it as the High Seas Treaty for very specific reasons, but you'll be hearing me use BBNJ. Now, if we can go to the next slide, I think when we're talking about areas beyond national jurisdiction, we lose a sense of proportion, because that part of the ocean, which is beyond national jurisdiction, is the Earth's largest commons. The ocean covers 71% of the Earth, and the areas beyond national jurisdictions are 2/3 of that. So we're talking a little bit under half the Earth is covered by this new instrument. And the focuses are on conservation and sustainable use. That's something Rachel talked about, and that's interesting, her remarks with regards to that balance. But we've heard from the earlier speakers about biodiversity and its important role in the ocean and how it underpins a range of ecosystem services, including carbon services, which life depends. Moving forward on the next slide. So I'm going to bring attention to the BB&J back to our global commitment under the CBD, because at the last COP, not the most recent one, COP15, we passed the Global Biodiversity Framework, which talks about, among other things, a 30 by 30 target, protecting 30% of the planet, including marine areas. Now, as of that COP15, we recognize approximately 1% of areas beyond national jurisdiction was protected. So how do we get to a global 30% if almost half of it is at 1.4%? We're not going to get there. Let me let you know this now. By 2030, we will not achieve target 3 because no one's taking the areas beyond national jurisdiction seriously enough. Please, let's go forward on the next slide. Now, there were a number of delegations who fought for more robust language on climate change into the BB&J agreement. And in Article 7 on general principles and approaches, you have the strongest statement where when it says maintain and restore ecosystem integrity, it was included the carbon cycle service that underpins the role of the ocean and climate, which you heard from everyone else how important that is. So the ocean, all of the ocean, not just coastal waters, not just national waters, all of the ocean is essential part of the solution that we hope the people at COP there in Azerbaijan are taking seriously. But there is in the BB&J a potential to harness the instrument and the tools it's going to provide to support carbon cycle services going forward by the ocean. Next slide, please. But BB&J's success is inseparable from one of the core components of that instrument, which is capacity building and transfer marine technology. There are other components like marine genetic resources, environmental impact assessments, etc. But let's focus on capacity building for a moment. And that goes back to the other panelist discussion of equity. If we move forward in my presentation, next slide. One thing about capacity building is it's inseparable from funding. And if we're talking about protected areas in the high seas, there was a 2022 Blue Nature Alliance report saying that we're going to need about $7 billion to establish protected areas across 30% of the high seas, with about $1 billion per year in operating costs. Keep those figures in mind. The rest of the slide goes into how much the ocean is globally underfunded. And now everyone's talking about ocean finance and finance. Finance is going to be a tricky instrument in areas beyond national jurisdiction for a lot of reasons. So we need to talk less about finance and much more about funding. And there we really need to turn to governments to step up, because I don't think the private sector is there yet. But unfortunately, governments are very interested in where constituencies are. And their constituencies are in terrestrial space, they're maybe in coastal waters, to a lesser degree of EEZs. But unfortunately, areas beyond national jurisdiction are really an orphan in that arena, with very little constituency from decision makers. So I don't think they're going to be taking it as seriously as the rest of us would like. Next slide. I want to highlight here from a developing country perspective, it's great talking about the triple planetary crisis of climate, biodiversity loss, pollution, but there's a debt crisis going on. Developing countries are barely able to meet sustainable development goals related to terrestrial space, less so perhaps in marine waters and EEZ. How are you going to expect them to effectively participate in that 47% of the ocean, which is the global commons covered by the BB&J Treaty? Well, they're probably not. And that's the story. Please, if we go forward in the slides. Now, the CBTMT, part of the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Treaty, is about equitable participation from all countries. We're all going to need to be part of the solution. And I would say to developed countries, the capacity building is an important investment, helping developing countries become the partners that you need to address this issue in the ocean space. But what we need is upfront funding to help that crucial development. And early assistance is needed to kickstart preparation of BB&J activities. Today, there is no credible pathway to fund BB&J implementation. Anyone who tells you different is selling you something. And there is a lot of snake oil salesmen out there. So scientists, please push back, because when some union tells you they've spent 40 million euros over the next 6 years, and we estimate we need 7 billion up front, you can see the challenge we have ahead of us. So moving forward in the slide, so far there are 14 deposits of signatures, ratifications that is. We need 60 for it to enter into force. I hear the EU and its member states shall be coming in quickly, but there's still a long way to 60 ratifications. We're not going to meet it by UNOC 3. We'll definitely not meet it by the next GEF, Global Environment Facility 9, which has a lot to do with funding the environmental space. We'll be very lucky if we actually meet it by 2030. So how are we going to hit our 30-30 goals if we haven't even entered this into force? We need concrete action now, as Rachel said. Next slide. So I was going to end my talk here that says, look, we need more than cheerleaders talking about what's coming and the number of ratifications. We need funding champions, because those people who talk prominently about high ambition, well, I think they define it differently than the plainly understood meaning of it. I don't think we have high ambition at all. And I think we need to be outspoken in that we expect more, because I tell you, by the end of UNOC 3, we will have not moved the dime on BB&J and therefore our efforts to the 30 by 30 goal. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fuad, for that very straightforward and frank take, which I think was very thought-provoking and engaging. Thank you very much for that. And next in line to speak here is actually myself. So I will try to move beyond the BB&J agreement, or rather see this more from a sort of bigger, higher perspective, from the perspective of ocean governance and ocean law, broadly speaking, and see how we better can work with integrating ocean carbon considerations into ocean law and governance. So next slide, please. So as we've heard in preceding presentations, we're gaining new knowledge on how ocean carbon works. I will discuss the potential of reforming ocean governance to promote these effects and discuss the role of law in this regard. Next slide, please. So in order to examine how management can be reformed, we must first understand how the system functions. Before discussing different future scenarios and what rules are required to create the desired future, we must first have a profound understanding of the baseline, where we are, what values existing ocean governance are designed to promote, and what incentives existing rules provide. And in spite of the oceans not being an element for human habitation, and law as a concept typically provide norms for human behavior in the territory of states, ocean governance is to a surprisingly high degree a rules-based system. Ocean governance is also a concept where international law has an unusual important standing and influence on state behavior. And the fact that the system is rules-based and not anarchic makes it viable to change. The fact that states largely appear to abide by the rules is positive. This implies a high likelihood that states will comply also to new rules. And at the center of ocean governance, there is the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, which effectively functions as a constitution for the oceans. UNCLOS is focused on establishing the extent of states' rights and obligations, as well as modalities for cooperation. Essentially, UNCLOS functions as a decentralized structure establishing what organizations is relevant for cooperation on different aspects of ocean management. And rules for cooperation are deeply fragmented. Mandate is scattered across a multitude of organizations aimed to promote certain interests. Next slide, please. And I think Rachel showed a similar slide before about how fragmented ocean governance is, not only in relation to sectoral agreements with mandate to regulate specific uses, but also in relation to what states have signed up for what obligations. This slide picture may be slightly outdated, but at least it shows how difficult this system is to navigate in certain aspects. Next slide, please. So central rules were developed under the law of the sea before knowledge of climate change was widespread. So an obvious problem is that climate or climate concerns are not part or even mentioned in the Law of the Sea Convention. What makes this problematic is that international law is inherently difficult to reform. There are theoretical ways to reform UNCLOS, but in reality, reform has been brought about by so-called implementing agreement. In 1996, the United Nations Fish Stocks Agreement was adopted, and in 2023, the BBNJ agreement that Fouad discussed. And the UN Fish Stocks Agreement provided new concepts such as the ecosystem approach, which now is being integrated in national policies in fisheries. And the BBNJ importantly mentions blue carbon and climate aspects while not providing instrumental rules on ocean carbon. So it's not impossible to envisage reform which promotes ocean carbon. There is this possibility for developing legal frameworks. So if the rules of the Law of the Sea Conventions were not designed to promote climate mitigation, what interests do they then aim to promote as they currently are written? General purpose are indicated in the Law of the Sea Convention itself, and that is about promoting peaceful uses of the seas and the oceans and the equitable and efficient utilizations of resources. There are also more specific purposes relating to specific human uses. For instance, the deep seabed regime of UNCLOS is formulated as aiming to foster healthy development of the world economy and a balanced growth of international trade and promoting international cooperation. So we have all these sort of purposes formulated in the convention, which also sort of explains the logics of the rules. But none of them really consider ocean carbon or climate aspects. So the problem is that we have a rules-based system which sort of influences states, but that the instructions are based on other considerations than the ones relating to climate or ocean carbon. Next slide, please. And when considering the biological carbon pump and ocean carbon, the most relevant part of the Law of the Sea would probably be the rules on marine living resources, which are the rules regulating international fisheries. And these rules, as they currently are formulated, are deeply problematic from the perspective of ocean carbon. So these rules are based on rights for states and indeed obligations for states to ensure that fish is caught at specific levels. It's very much based on and driven by the logic and rationale as fish as a food resource, which not only can, but should be harvested by humans. It builds on this idea of optimum utilization, that humans can find a level where fish can be caught at high levels, which ensures a regeneration, which produces a maximum amount of food. And this connects to the concept of MSY, maximum sustainable yield, which was considered at the time of the negotiation of the convention as this sort of golden rule, which would, direct fisheries management in a sustainable way, but since has been considered as very problematic by scientists. And the problem is that the logic of these rules on marine living resources very much goes against what we try to promote with regards to fish stocks when we look at it from the perspective of ocean carbon. If we look at it from the perspective of ocean carbon, we rather want to increase biomass beyond the levels indicated by MSY. We also want to promote conservation of species which are particularly important in sequestering carbon and promoting ocean carbon. And also, perhaps we might be interested in protecting certain individuals more than others, top predators, large fish, etc. And also, ocean carbon in fisheries may call for certain types of gear and tougher restrictions on bycatch. And all of this is difficult, but not impossible to bring about under the current rules. So what we try to, and I think what we should focus on more, is to see what regulatory reform ocean carbon calls for and how that could be formulated as legal policy proposals. Next slide, please. So this is very much about sort of trying to integrate climate and ocean carbon as a concern in fisheries management. Can we complement maximum sustainable yield with maximum climate mitigation? What if we put climate mitigation and ocean carbon sequestration on pair with maximum sustainable yield, or even perhaps as more important when looking at the objectives of fisheries management? Next slide, please. So here I've included a bunch of policy proposals that potentially could be turned into legal policy proposals, which would, emphasize and promote ocean carbon in different ways. First of all, as I said, one thing we could do is try to add maximum carbon sequestration, MCS, as an added element to the existing AMSY. We could try to bring about rules which save large fishes within species. Generally, integrating the ecosystem approach would benefit ocean carbon, as well as concern associated or dependent species, try to prevent bycatch more than we already do, and also try to prevent the use of gears which are particularly destructive in relation to ocean carbon services, such as bottom trawling. So thank you very much. That was my short presentation. And now we're moving from the side of frameworks and policy and science to what we actually need. And that is concrete action relation to the protection of ocean carbon. And with us to give us that perspective is Ms. Karen Stone, who is the director of the Vavao Environmental Protection Association, VEPA, in Tonga. She's a local community-based conservation organization that implements ocean and terrestrial programs to increase resilience to the impacts of climate change and habitat destruction, including community-based fisheries, marine spatial planning, awareness campaign, and research initiatives to ensure healthy, productive ocean habitats. Karen, we're so glad to have you with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and Malo and Lele from the Kingdom of Tonga. And good evening, very close to midnight here. Thank you. Next slide. Just to give you all a little bit of context in case you don't know the Kingdom of Tonga, we're located obviously in the South Pacific. We're a very large ocean, small island state. In fact, 99% of our considered area is oceans and less than 1% is land. We have estimated EEZ of nearly 700,000 square kilometers, and we have the second deepest trench in the world to the east, and the west side is the Lao Basin, which is comprised of all the seamounts and underwater volcanoes. Next slide, please. Tonga is very reliant on its oceans. It provides fisheries and subsistence harvesting. Tourism relies heavily on it, and our tourism is whales, and they rely heavily on the Antarctic krill. So we're very, very keen to always make sure that our Antarctic krill is being conserved and looked after as well. The shipping and transportation, of course, as a small island, we rely heavily on imports, but we're also, really need our oceans to be sustainable. We need them to be healthy, and we need them to be resilient to climate change impacts. As we move forward, Tonga is expanding into ocean-based renewable energy, and obviously innovations that are needed to take us and to continue to take Tonga forward, both socially and economically as well. Next slide, please. I'm very grateful to be a part and support the government of Tonga in their national ocean management and marine spatial planning. The wonderful people in the photo is called Ocean 7. It's the 7 lead ministries in Tonga, including fisheries, natural resources, environment, shipping, that have been doing all this work. So Tonga has committed to the 30 by 30, as everyone has talked about here, and it's been approved to have 30% inshore and offshore protected areas, and Tonga has also committed to 100% sustainably managed ocean area. Currently, the Ocean Management Plan was passed by Cabinet in 2021, and it's pending the legislation to enact the Ocean Management Plan. And that will be the first Ocean Management Act that encompasses all ocean activities in Tonga. They've also drafted the first national ocean policy, and that links really all activities outside of the MSP, so including other ocean activities that aren't related to the 30 by 30 goals. Next slide, please. How do we do offshore marine protection when you don't have all the information available? Obviously, we don't know where our best carbon sinks are. We don't know where our best habitats are. And this work was supported technically outside of Tonga by IUCN, also Wake Institute, GIZ. So there was lots of input going into this. So regional work went into it, satellite data went into it on chlorophyll, on mapping where our plankton blooms are, phytoplankton blooms are, mapping our tuna fisheries, mapping our habitat uses, mapping our resource uses. And we came up with bioregions. And the replication of offshore marine protected areas was placed to have each of those bioregions representatively covered within the 30%. Is it perfect? No. But is anything ever perfect? No. You know, obviously it's hard when we don't know everything. There's a great resource that's online called the Tonga Marine Atlas, which is maximizing benefits for Tonga. And this was produced under the MacBio program. And it really goes in depth into all the focus areas, ecological, social, and economic benefits of Tonga's ocean. Next slide, please. We do have some good things. A lot of you have talked about, obviously, we don't have bottom trawling in Tonga. Bottom trawling has the potential of disturbing the benthic habitats. We do, unfortunately, have deep sea mining as a potential activity upcoming in the future. Tonga is a partner in the CCZ zone and is looking towards the potential for deep sea mining to offset future needs for innovation of things. Natural disasters, we, as many of you know, and some of you may have been able to use the satellite data on when our Hunga Tonga Hunga Hapai explosion happened in 2022. And the massive amount of phytoplankton and plankton blooms that occurred because of the iron and sulfur going into the water. Unfortunately, we only found out about it when we got communications back on in Tonga, which was about 6 months later. But, you know, there's some amazing new science that's come out of that, but also there's concerns, you know, because we are in a place with large volcanic activities, is how can those natural ecosystems and natural activities also impact our resilience? And the key, I think, for everyone is that we always need more information. We're very information poor in Tonga. We don't have the ability, the resources, and the technology to go and get everything that we need. So we use a lot of the international data that's available, but obviously that is limiting to all of us. Next slide, please. So to take it even more local, my main role as the director of VIPA is we live on the Northern Islands called Vava'u. There's 11,000 people here. We have a small University of the South Pacific campus, and each year we take on the students, and they come and they learn all about their ocean activities. They develop awareness programs. They go out into their own communities and schools. And we want them to not just read about the science that everyone else is putting out there. We want them to actually go out and do the science themselves. So they go out and they do, you know, plankton tows. They go out and they do coastal water monitoring, water quality monitoring. And also they go and talk to their communities, because every time we go out with new data or new science, we also want to understand the cultural impacts, the cultural values of the data that we're presenting back to them. Next slide, please. So, I mean, for me, and I'm really grateful to all the other presenters and the large, vast information that they've shared today. But for us, you know, within these countries and within these states that are very, very vulnerable to climate change, we don't talk about ocean carbon capture and all the ocean processes enough in country, in our policies, in any of the legislations. We need to make sure that it does align to how it does benefit livelihoods and economies, there is that link between the deep ocean and coastal areas. So it is important that our communities realize that what happens in their national waters, but also in the BBNJ, is impacting their livelihoods, and that they are a part of it, and they are a strong voice in making sure that it goes the right way. Also, for us, climate resilience and climate change discussions are often too focused on changing infrastructure and not always on protecting the natural and key ocean processes. Again, I want to thank you very much, Mahalo Opito, for having us on this presentation. Mahalo.
No, it's us thanking you for taking part in this, Karen, and thank you for a very, very interesting presentation, and very, I think I have a lot of questions relating to your work with this NGO. It sounds very exciting. And if you don't mind, I will actually start off this sort of Q&A section. And by the way, for those who are interested and have questions, there is a Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom page. I will actually take the liberty to start off by asking you a question, Karen. I mean, with this important work that you do with your organization, which is really what we need, I think, in relation to these important climate events. What you make of what you heard before your presentation relating to frameworks, global rules, but perhaps in particular issues relating to funding, as discussed by Fouad, and knowledge gaps. What do you feel? What do you need from the perspective of your NGO, and what would you benefit more from? And what do you make of this?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's always the big question, isn't it? There's never going to be enough resources to implement and to put in everything on that wish list, and there's never going to be enough to go around for every country to do it. I guess, I mean, the government obviously needs, the strong resourcing, the technical capabilities being built up, the innovations coming in to help them monitor that. From our perspective, it's a lot to do with, yes, making sure communities have the accessibility to this information, making sure that our governments have the money to come back to the communities and tell them what's going on, that it doesn't just stay in these big spaces, that it actually becomes personal to Tongans as well. So yeah, funding, capacity building, but I think also accessibility is a key thing for us.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And connecting that to Fouad's presentation, Fouad, you spoke a lot about resources, funding, and the insufficiency of promised resources. Are these the sort of projects and initiatives we want and that we need in order to promote ocean carbon and to ensure a good implementation of what's written in the BBNJ agreement? What's your take on that, Fouad?
Well, of course, I think all these small projects in aggregate are part of the effort that is needed. But I believe, as Karen suggested, that there is never enough resources. And I think she's primarily talking about within the national space. So if there aren't enough resources in that national space, then how can we expect any progress in that areas beyond national jurisdiction that has no constituency? I think probably this will be my last chance to speak. So I'll tell you one tangible thing we need to be thinking about in terms of the climate COP. If we could simply get the finance committee for the climate COP to have on its annual agenda the ocean, and they made a similar decision in 2018, the member states, to expand the finance committee's mandate to forests, having them analyze and report on oceans every year back to the member states would be a positive step out of the climate conference COP. But other than that, we need a big basket of funding, and we need some major actors to step forward and promote it. And I'm not seeing that anywhere. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Fouad. And of course, action and funding to bring about action is central here. But we've also discussed quite extensively scientific backgrounds and scientific understandings of ocean carbon. And it seems like there's a lot of interesting natural science going on in this field, and we're starting to understand more, but there are still knowledge gaps relating to ocean carbon and ocean carbon services in the ocean. And in relation to that, I have a question which would be interesting to hear reflected on from the scientists in the room. So if we had a science knowledge fairy suddenly appearing, which could grant you one or perhaps two scientific wishes that would fill in ocean carbon information gaps, what would you wish for? Where should we focus our attention in terms of scientific development and understanding and research? What's your take on that? Any scientist in the room who'd be interested in replying to that?
I can give it a go.
Please, Richard.
Well, I mean, my take on this is that from a purely what's the ocean doing with carbon perspective, the rate limiting step at the moment is a lack of suitable technologies to really measure air sea fluxes. So we have ships that go to some parts of the world, we have research vessels in others, but there's an awful lot of the ocean that isn't really that well observed. And we have some platforms that go there, but they don't carry sensors. So I would advocate for a sort of mixed technological and theoretical analysis of how we really do the basic ocean carbon accounting properly.
Thank you very much. That's a good suggestion. More ideas, and please be brief. Richard, I think you were very brief and good. So Emma, please, what's your take on this?
Yeah, similar, but for the biology, like I want to know how much mass is in the ocean of all the different species that are important in the biological pump. So there's been some work to like progress seeing krill from space. And it's actually quite important from policy, right? Because if there's a fishery and it's going, taking krill or other fish, or not other, they're not fish, taking fish, and we can say, oh, at the moment there's loads of krill, they're breeding, they're doing this, then we can just pause the fishery. Having that like dynamic relationship between data and policy would be really helpful. But at the moment, we can just say we think that there's this much krill in the ocean on average every year, and not much better than that. So yeah, knowing how much stuff is in the ocean.
Better data could be a good idea. Natalia, what would you ask the fairy to deliver to you in terms of scientific knowledge?
Yeah, I mean, I would also agree with both Richard and Emma's perspective on kind of the need for better observation so we can really kind of constrain our understanding of both kind of air sea fluxes and then the specific biological processes. Kind of from the perspective of marine carbon dioxide removal, I mean, I would like the knowledge fairy to kind of grant us the information on kind of which methods have kind of the greatest ability to scale with the least environmental harm, and then where kind of how they interact with other types of ocean industries and other governance regimes so that we can kind of identify quickly whether this is actually a viable solution so that we don't spend a lot of effort and a lot of kind of funding going down this trajectory that could also lead people away from also doing decision changing, behavior changing. Basically, I would like the knowledge fairy to grant us the knowledge of whether this is actually a viable pathway forward.
Let's hope all these wishes come true. So, Rachel, you're one of the people who sort of bridges the gap between science and policy, if I dare say so, in this field. And you travel, and you have traveled to a lot of conference of parties in international environmental law and also law of the sea. So what's your impression from these meetings? Do you think the scientific basis is sound, and does science have the role it should have in the rooms, and does that differ across different corporations? Perhaps a difficult question to answer, but it'd be interesting to hear you develop on your experience on the interface between sort of science and policy development.
Yeah, I would say that science is not where the problem lies. Yes, we can get a lot of data. Of course, we need data harmonization because you'll get data from a million different sensors and in different formats. But getting the data, I mean, that's a matter of tapping into industry and getting industry more involved. But all the data in the world and all the best knowledge in the world will help us nothing if policymakers and countries are not willing to implement it, and if there's no funding to help developing nations in enabling them to be part of the solution. So we're at a standstill where we have, heck, I mean, the world is filled with amazing scientists. There's enough fishing vessels in the world to go out there and help us get the data. It's probably even funding, if you look for it, to get sensors on every vessel. But if there's a lack of action and there's a lack of interest globally to actually implement the changes that are needed, we even know what the answers are and what is needed, but we're not willing to implement it at any stage, even in Norway. So when you can't even get, again, taking back to when you can't even get Norway to fulfill their obligations, how are you going to enable countries where the capacity is so much lower and the finance gap is so large to be able to be part of the solution? It's oh God, I'm so negative now. We'll find a solution. We'll work together with it. You need to work across levels. It needs to be fully and absolutely holistic and transdisciplinary, and we all need to work together, right? But we all need to work together with industry as well, because they work a heck of a lot faster than government does and policymakers do. So if you can get them on board and be part of the solution, then yes, we'll get where we need to go, but it's not going to be hinging on science.
Thank you very much. I think that was very thoughtful. So we've heard a bunch of ideas on where we should go. And Natalia even had a policy brief with her, which she shared with us. So speaking of ocean carbon and policy recommendation, I think a lot of things we've mentioned have referred to the importance of increasing biomass and biomass promoting sort of ocean carbon services. But on a more detailed level, what do we need more than that in terms of concrete policy recommendations? What would be the key and most important lessons for anyone taking part in the UNFCCC Conference of Parties to bear with her or him at the back of their head when going into negotiation rooms? Any ideas?
Niels, could I just jump in there?
Sure.
Yeah. So I was really intrigued by some of the material you were presenting around the possibility of tensioning basically the protein supplying service that fisheries offer humanity versus the sort of climate regulating service that fisheries offer humanity. Now, Ocean ICU is doing a lot of kind of like theoretical work around that, and attempting to produce tools that allow people to explore that. But I think if you were kind of going into a negotiation at this stage, then just simply having in your mind that the ocean ecosystem does at least two things for humanity, and the relationship between them isn't clear cut. But we shouldn't just view them as delivering a single service. I think there's a big piece of work that we collectively can do after this webinar, thinking through how to explore that tension. But that's the take-home message for me.
Thanks. I think that's very thoughtful. We should go from sort of a singular to more of a sort of multi-dimensional perspective on ocean management, including climate considerations and ocean carbon.
The sort of big questions that I think people are wrestling with now is how do you tension, I mean, everything you do has an effect. And different courses of action have different effects. And how do you tension the benefits and disbenefits of different activity pathways, different shared socio and economic pathways against each other? These are not easy questions, but they're ones that we need to grapple with.
Thank you very much. I think there's time for one more question or one more reflection, and there is one in the chat, I think, for Fuad. What benefits will first movers gain from ratifying the BBNJ as soon as possible, especially those in least developed countries, small island developed states, etc.?
Well, thank you, Niels, for that question. I think that's an interesting question because, of course, when there's so limited funds out there from developed countries, the developing countries that are the first movers put themselves really at the front of the queue. And I think they're very clever in being the first movers. The fact of the matter is though, that queue won't go so far. And I think it'll be expended quite quickly and not even meet the needs of those first movers. So I think it goes to the overall count of ratifications that gets us closer to 60. But I think the real question is after a little bit, the rest of the developing countries are going to ask themselves, well, I'm taking on these legal obligations, which have financial responsibilities. Where's the money going to come from? And I think their legislatures who are actually going to approve the ratification are definitely asking their executive branch that question, and they don't have an answer. So unless we're going to mobilize some big money to give confidence, then I think we're well on track to this entering into force after 2030. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fuad, and perhaps a call for action in many different regards. I think we're reaching the end of this seminar. Time is basically up, but I hope that this was inspiring and thoughtful and provided some learnings for not only the people in this room listening, but also for people beyond this room. It will be posted online, so feel free to forward this to colleagues who might be interested. And thank you all very much for taking part, all panelists, of course, for presenting and engaging in discussion. For me, it was a very good learning experience. I hope it was the same for you guys. And thank you all people attending the seminar and joining. And there will be more Virtual Ocean Pavilion talks to look out for and listen for. So thank you all very much and have a good day or afternoon, wherever you are.